What's the scariest true story you've heard or told? I've told this story before. I'm an eye doctor and I had a patient come to me with an infected eyelid. 2 other eye doctors tried to treat and failed. They were dumping all sorts of medicine into it and it wasn't getting any better. At this point, it was swollen and painful for weeks with no improvements despite being on tons of meds. Apparently, neither of them thought to flip the lid upside down. You know that gross trick some kids do with their upper eyelids. It was a painful maneuver for her very swollen eyelid, which might explain it. Anyhow, there appeared to be what looked like a visible abscess inside the tissue with thick gooey material. I thought I'd give it a nudge and saw it move. This wasn't an abscess, it was something else. I managed to remove it quite easily in one whole piece. It was a fly larva. The patient told me that she had a bug hit her in the eye a few days before she got this infection. I removed the larva and within 2 days the wound closed and she was 100% recovered on basic antibiotic eye drops. Yes, I do have the photos from this case for those interested. TLDR. Patient had a bug lay an egg in her eyelid and I removed the larva. What a terrible day to be literate. My HIV story. I was on a trip on my first commercial flight from Sacramento to San Diego to visit my girlfriend, and I didn't feel well. Once I got off the plane I made it to the hotel and had bouts of nausea and diarrhea for a few days straight and finally decided to go to hospital. After waiting hours I was let into a room and some time later an Asian woman wearing a mask and gloves entered. "Please leave the room," she told my girlfriend. "Let's call Beatrice." "No, she can stay, it's okay," I said. The doctor still hadn't looked at me, but looked back to Beatrice. "I think you should leave." I looked at Beatrice and said, "Can you please wait outside?" Right as the door closed the doctor said, "You have HIV." My mind instantly started racing, trying to problem solve. I can't have AIDS. I got tested before being with Beatrice and I was clean. I said. The doctor again, "You have HIV," while avoiding eye contact. I looked at my palms and for the first time in my life they were sweating. Really sweating. I said again, "I can't. I've been tested." The doctor flipped a page and asked my name, which I responded. And finally the doctor's eyes made contact with my own. "I'm so sorry, I have the wrong chart. You have strep throat and laryngitis." I remember the world ending and then the feeling the most relief I've ever experienced in my life. When I told Beatrice the whole story she awkwardly laughed and said, "But you don't have AIDS." Right to this day when I tell people what happened a good portion say, "But you don't have AIDS." Right, whole lot of frickin' nope. My ex told my kids I gave him AIDS. I don't have it. Haven't seen my 3 kids for 6 years because of this and many other lies. The story of John Edward Jones getting stuck in Nutty Putty Cave in Utah. He became wedged in the tight crawl when he took a wrong turn in the cave system. Rescuers could do nothing to get him out and he was stuck in there for 28 hours before he died from cardiac arrest because feet were above his head and his heart was pumping overtime. One of the rescuers even gave him a phone to call his wife and talk to his young daughter before he died. Rescuers were unable to remove the body without risking their own lives, so they sealed the caves. It became his tomb. This happened with my sister-in-law when she was about 11 or 12. Her and her family lived in a trailer park. Just down the street was her bus stop for school. Each morning, she would see a man in his trailer taking pictures of her and her friends. It creeped her out, so she went to tell her mom, my mother-in-law, of what this guy was doing and how he would just stand in the window staring at them and taking pictures. So, her mom calls the police and report him. The police didn't do anything. This went on for about another 2 weeks with no action from the police, to where now my sister-in-law is terrified to stand and wait for the school bus and her mom had to call the police again. This time, the police actually arrived at this pervert's house and lo and behold, her and the other families watched from afar with this guy cuffed up and being escorted to the police cruiser. I had brain surgery roughly 3 years ago. I lost my concept of time. What felt like 4 months was only 3 days. The amount of physical, mental, and emotional pain I went through was crazy. I had to find all of my memories and relearn how to walk, talk, everything. If you want to go through something terrifying, that is it. This thread is probably dead now, but when I was about 4 and my brother 11, we stayed at my aunt's between moving house. Her neighbor had a son my brother's age. so my bro used to go play with him on weekends etc. One day my brother goes over after lunch. The dad opens the door, says the kids and mom are out shopping, but come on in and have some juice and tell him about how the move is going. My bro goes in, has a drink and a chat, then comes back to my aunt's after no more than an hour. A few days later police are all over the place. Turns out the dad murdered his wife and kids, and was in the middle of burying them in the back garden around the time my brother knocked. Crazy to think what could be different if my brother had visited a couple of hours before, or caught that guy on an off day. I would say your brother did catch him on an off day. Off the main road of a place I used to work at, a guy decided to climb under a bus to hitch a free ride. Well, the bus went over a speed bump and the guy fell and ended up getting caught on the back wheel. His body was dragged 5 blocks before the bus driver realized what was happening. A police officer who came into our store regularly told us that the guy was still alive when they got to him, but died an hour later. He said his whole back was scraped off, exposing his spine. I remember driving down that road after the fact, and you could still see a deep red blood-stained trail going on for those 5 blocks. Absolutely horrifying. I can't even imagine the freaking pain. Viral account. I used to love swimming. I'd go snorkeling, scuba diving, even jumped off a few cliffs into the water. When I was about 18 I read the Necronomicon, the collection of Lovecraft short stories, not the real thing. Had a good scare, giggled at how silly I was to be unnerved and went about my life. Next year went to Crete on holiday. First day I jumped right into the ocean with my dad and went out deep. Lo and behold, I feel something tickling my legs. I dive under to see since it's too deep for seaweed to reach this high and I wanted to see fish. Tentacles everywhere. I was so shocked I lost my air and panicked hard. I started breathing in water as glowing eyes, sharp beaks and suckered tentacles flashed about me. Thankfully, Dad got me to the shore and didn't understand what was going on. He'd seen nothing but suddenly had a really grim look on his face. Went to the doctors. Turns out I'm the victim of a family curse. Schizoaffective disorder. My dad was horrified cause since he hadn't got it like his brother and mother. He thought I'd be safe. They caught it early, but this revelation then led to a lot of aspects of my life being thrown in the air. Entire people in my life became false. Ideas I'd had were delusional. Outbursts revealed to be due to mood swings. I'm doing much better now. I still don't go in the water. It truly scares me that our own minds can do this crap to us. Can't imagine what it's like going through something like that. Glad you're going better now. Stay safe out there. One of our employees fell into the hammer box. This is a device filled with ultra high torque rotating hammers used to grind up large appliances into scrap metal. It apparently turned 3 times before the emergency shutoff was hit, pulling in half the employee's body at a diagonal running from the middle of his pelvis to his shoulder. The gruesome part was that he was still alive, as the pressure from the hammers was holding the enormous wound shut. Took 30 minutes for EMTs to arrive while he screamed for them to simply turn the machine back on and end it. He didn't make it. I hear all these stories about workplace deaths from crazy appliances, and I wonder how there aren't dozens of safety restrictions to prevent them. When I was much younger we lived across the street from a big family. He had a wife and 5 sons, and one night he brought his whole family into the living room and lined them up and pulled a shotgun out from under the couch and shot himself in the head. The kids were messed up again for the rest of their lives. Short story. My wife is from Enterprise, and I guess a kid in her school got beheaded on his way home. Was literally found with his head cut off on the side of the street, and to this day no one knows who did it or how it happened. Absolutely gives me chills. A kid from a couple towns away from me lived on a farm with his girlfriend. They were in the kitchen one night. She was cooking and him and his friend were cleaning their guns at the table. His went off and shot her, killing her immediately. He then loaded up, ran outside and shot himself in the head. Walking my dog and crossing the street with a green light and a guy blows through the red light and almost hits me and the dog. I yell butthole and he slams on his brakes and turns around and pulls into parking lot ahead of me. I get closer and see the car has Illinois plates. I live in PA. He says careful who call butthole, I've killed people. I just keep walking and he drives away. The next day I hear spree killer Andrew Cunanan used a stolen credit card at a gas station in my town. 100% was him. I called a butthole. To be fair, it sounds like he was being in Butthole. One day as a kid I was exploring the forests near our house with my cousin. The forest was on a hill, but there were several craters there because of bombs that were dropped there during the World Wars. Germany. One day we saw a backpack at the bottom of one. We tried to climb down, but it was kinda steep and slippery, so we didn't want to risk falling. We planned on returning later with a rope, and went home. The next day news story was that there was a backpack found with the remains of a girl in that forest. A guy walking his dog found it after the dog wouldn't stop barking and going crazy at the edge of the crater while staring at the backpack. We stopped exploring the forests after. You just got saved from being haunted by a memory for your whole freaking life. This week in Cologne, from the wall next to Autobahn, a concrete plate fell down into ongoing traffic and hit one car, killing the driver. After the inspection, they found another 6 plates that weren't properly constructed, just like the one that fell down. I worked at an animal hospital in Las Vegas and loved it, until one day when I hear something off over the radio as I'm doing my walks. We get a lot of feedback, and it was a short transmission, but I was certain it sounded like someone screaming, with a dog barking in the background. It was very short though. I wasn't sure, but I trusted my gut. I jogged over to the main treatment building and looked in. No screaming, no panic. Thought I was tripping. Decided to check the luxury boarding building, where my boss Gabi was. Silence. I decided to trust my gut again, and walk further into the building, despite no one else seeming alarmed here either. I walked to the end of the hall where my boss would be, and peered through the small plexiglass window in the door. First thing I see is blood, smeared on the walls. I freeze for a second, and bust in. There's blood smeared on the wall, floor, countertops, doors. My 120-pound female boss is between 2 pit bulls ruthlessly fighting to the death. The dogs are locked onto each other, and she's trying to pull them apart, repeatedly losing her footing from all of the blood on the floor. I grab the attacking dog from behind by his collar. Gabi grabs the dog being attacked, whining. It doesn't work. I start radioing for help, maybe 10 seconds straight of screaming for help, before I drop the radio and had to attend to the fight again. The aggressor unclamps and reclamps on the dog's neck. I'm out of ideas and help isn't coming, so I look around and see a 10-pound metal food bowl on the counter. I grab it, pause, look at my boss to see if she's cool with my plan, and she says yes. So I wail on this dog 7-8 times until he lets go and walks away. I take the wounded dog to treatment, furious and covered in blood, as they listen to Easy Rock W their radios off. Bonus. A receptionist asks me later that day what all that noise on the radio was about. I asked her what she meant and what she heard. I heard someone like screaming and saying there was an emergency, but I was with a client and it was really loud, so I turned it down. I of course am tasked with cleaning up all of the blood. I then quit. I think the story of Tina Fey getting the scare on her face is super fricked up. She was a kid just sitting and playing in her front yard when a random guy pulled up, got out of his car and slashed her face for no reason with a razor. WTF. When I was a kid we lived on a large acreage. One night we came home late and as we entered the driveway we noticed a car pulled over down the road against the ditch that bordered our property. We saw 2 people, one of them climbing out of the ditch. When we parked my mom told my dad to go see if they were okay or needed help. My dad said that they looked to be okay and it was probably not a good idea, so we all went in and to bed. The next morning we were woken up by the police. They had our whole yard taped off because some horseback riders had noticed a leg sticking out of a black plastic bag in the ditch exactly where that car was parked. That look on my mom's face I'll never forget. We know for sure my dad wouldn't have made it back home alive if he had listened to my mom that night. Dad knew what was up, saved more than himself that night. He saved all of you, whether it be mentally or physically. One of my dad's friend's wife was murdered by some crazy dude walking down the street. This guy had just been released from a mental hospital and literally just stabbed her as she walked home. When my dad's friend came back he thought she had just taken the dogs out for a walk, so he walked along the normal walk route and he saw loads of blue lights. He was stopped by a police officer and wasn't allowed any closer until he saw that it was his wife. Last year, there was a girl named Ruth who went to University of Illinois Chicago. She was heading out from an event and was catcalled by a man who followed her into a parking garage. He killed and raped her, then just left her there. She went to a high school near me and it breaks my heart to recall the story. My mother never taught me to swim because when she was a teenager she saw a friend get sucked into a whirlpool at the bottom of a drainage lake that is the deepest body of water within a few hundred miles of us. They didn't find his body for days. My dad watched his brother drown as a child and was unable to do anything about it because he was so young and didn't know how to swim. Completing 8 levels of swimming lessons was mandatory for me as a child. When I was young, I saw a documentary about a guy who got flesh-eating bacteria in his nasal cavity. It ate his face and he's still alive. Eventually they removed the bacteria by removing the eaten parts of his face. He got a prosthetic face, which back in those days was basically a plastic Halloween mask that tried to look human. At the end of the documentary, he took the mask off. His face from his forehead down to his mouth was just a hole. Well, I didn't need sleep tonight. My mom was stalked by a guy in her chemistry class. This was back in the late 70s, during her first semester at college. They were lab partners, and mom thought he seemed cute and nice, and was too shy at the time to ask him out, but she said if he'd asked her out, she would have went. They were friendly with each other in class, but their paths didn't cross outside of that since they were in different majors. As the semester wore on, however, she noticed he was often waiting for her outside of her other classes, the library, the student union, out in front where her dad picked her up and dropped her off. This continued into the spring semester. Puzzled, but not yet alarmed, she asked him how he always seemed to know where she was. He proudly said, "Oh, I asked the registrar's office for a copy of your schedule." My mom went to complain to the secretary who gave out her schedule, and the secretary blew it off because you guys are dating. Luckily, mom had already arranged to transfer to a different school for sophomore year, and spent the remaining time left avoiding him. She never saw him after that, but it wasn't over. Flash forward to grad school. Mom was at work, and grandma gets a knock on the door. Since the man at the door was in a naval uniform, and my grandmother was a Navy nurse, she let the man in, because he looked rather sad. He starts off by saying how sorry he is for my mother's loss, which completely mystified grandma. "Well, mom, I just got back from overseas, and I found out my friend recently killed himself. He spoke so highly of his fiancée, your daughter, and I wanted to meet her." My grandmother told him her daughter didn't even have a boyfriend at the moment, let alone a fiancé. It doesn't take too long to establish the man's deceased friend in question was in fact mom's stalker. The naval lieutenant was pretty upset, and my grandmother even more so. She made him leave before mom got home. The weird thing about the stalker's death is that it was ruled a suicide, but he hanged himself from a very high up tree branch you'd need a ladder to get to, and his hands were tied behind his back. From what my mother later learned, he had a tendency to snoop and generally stick his nose in places they didn't belong besides the obvious stalking thing, and this didn't win him too many friends. So it's anyone's guess who he might have pee off. My mom always concludes this story kind of nonchalantly, like, yeah, back in those days, they didn't really know much about stalking. They've gotten a little better in terms of awareness now. It gives me the creeps to think what could have happened if he escalated his attempts to follow her after she left that school. Back in those days they also didn't look too deeply into suicides when the victim was a questionable personality. I was in the drunk tank with a guy who beat another man to death. The guy didn't die immediately, was in intensive care for 3 days and died in the hospital. The man who killed him told me specific details about it, and on the 3rd day, when the guy in IC died, the COs came in the cell and put him in isolation across the hall. They left him in general pop until the guy actually died, and once he was officially charged with capital murder then they took him out of our cell. I was 17 at the time. Never forget being scared to fall asleep right next to this dude. I was in a cell in classification unit with a guy who had killed someone. All he would talk about was Jesus and the Bible though. My mom's best friend was driving home from work one night when she got pulled over from a police officer. She had no idea why, but figured it could be a tail light or something, so she pulled over. When the officer approached, He confirmed to her that her tail light was out and asked for license and registration, so she gave it to him and he disappeared to his car for a while. Later, when he came back, he started asking her weirder and weirder questions. They started regularly. Where are you going? Where did you come from? But then they started getting personal. Do you have a husband at home? Any children? Any weapons? Any daughters? Any aggressive pets? Once he started getting concerningly personal, she told him that it was inappropriate to be asking these questions. Then he started getting aggressive. I'm a freaking cop. Do you know what that means? It means you shut the frick up and do what I say. Step out of the car. Obviously she was pretty scared at this point. She rolled up the window and started looking through her purse for her phone. At this point, the officer was straight up violent. He was pounding on her window and trying her door, yelling crazy crap. Get out of the fricking car, you dirty fricking ass, I said out. So, in a full-blown panic, she stepped on the gas and drove away. A chase occurred for a short while, but the cop quickly stopped following her as she got closer to the main road. She then called 911, where she learned that there was no officers that were supposed to be in that location. In the coming days it turned out that there was a rapist who was posing as a cop in that area. She never even had a broken tail light, but he had her address, her personal info, and even knew about her husband and daughter. She told him she didn't own weapons, so she immediately purchased a pistol. Unfortunately, she was forced to live in fear for a while until they caught the man. My mom was study partners with Ted Bundy. He invited her to go to his apartment to study. A law professor pulled her aside after class and warned her that he was being investigated by the FBI. Shortly after, he was arrested but escaped from prison. Left behind in his jail cell was my mom's name and address. Without the law professor's warning, it could have turned out much differently. When I worked in healthcare, I had a patient who got a sinus infection. He stopped taking his antibiotics after a few days because he felt better. His sinus infection came back with a vengeance. When he got to the emergency department, he was presenting with stroke symptoms. The infection had spread to his cranial cavity. There was so much pus that it was twisting his brain. No one thought he would survive the surgery. The family was advised to expect the worst. Amazingly, he actually survived. He ended up needing 3 more surgeries to wash out and spent almost 2 months in the hospital. Take your full dose of antibiotics, people. This happened to a colleague, except he lay for 4 days semi-conscious on the floor of his house until another colleague went to look for him. He very nearly died. A van of 6 people and a driver are on the way to an engagement. Lonely roads and the driver dozes off. He wakes up and realizes that the van has gone out of his control, and in the second he has, decides to save himself and jumps out through his door. Van out of control. Runs down. Tosses and rolls. 4 people in the van died on the spot. 1 lucky person survived with minor fractures. The other person had barely survived. She had her skull cracked, the bone under her eyes broken and caved in, glass from the window stuck to her eyes, the nasal bone broken, jaw broken and teeth fell out, shoulder bone broken and dislocated, hip bone fractured, toes broken and a huge chunk of skin gone in her feet. She was wheeled into the hospital and performed surgeries on. She said the only thing that got her through was thinking that her kids would grow motherless. When I saw her post-surgery, she was completely wrapped in bandages like the Invisible Man, gaps for eyes and a hole for lips. She couldn't speak for months and couldn't walk for a year. This was my mom and the year was 2006. I was 9 or 10 then, and the memory of her mummified form still haunts me in my dreams. When I was about 5, woke up to my house surrounded by loud voices and bright white lights. A group of robbers broke into our house after some kind of heist and were using us as hostages with rifles. The police had our house surrounded. My parents, grandparents, and I didn't really speak English back then, so my 12-year-old sister had to translate the demands to the police and instructions to us. My grandma told me to go back to sleep, which I somehow easily did. Edit. The end of the story. After falling asleep and waking up the next day, everything was fine. The only thing everyone kept talking about were where the robbers were standing. They decided not to have too many entrances from the house, so they barricaded themselves in our kitchen. Apparently the entire kitchen floor was covered in guns. I kept asking what happened, but my family was firmly in the mindset of don't tell the kids anything. ever. Since little kid me was kind of dumb and nothing really happened to me directly, I forgot about the situation for years. I asked again but they still don't want to talk about it. It's still kind of scary to think that, had they wanted to, I could have died in my sleep that night. NGL pretty nice of the robbers to not wake up the little kid. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.